When detectives finally found the Romanov burial site, they realized something was very, very wrong. Alexei Romanov was missing. Rumors persisted that he had somehow escaped, but in truth, his fate was even darker than his family. Nearly a century after his death, archaeologists made a discovery that finally revealed the disturbing truth. Alexei Nikolaevich of House Romanov was born on August 12, 1904, behind the shining walls of the extravagant Peterhof Palace in St. Petersburg. He was the fifth child born to his parents, Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra. But his royal parents were only the tip of the iceberg. Alexei's family tree had more kings and queens than a deck of cards. But his most powerful connection came from his great-grandmother, Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom. However, anyone who knows much about Queen Victoria's family knows that her genes had one fatal flaw. She carried the gene that caused hemophilia. Alexei's parents knew that any child of theirs might fall prey to those genes, but for now they simply rejoiced and prayed their new Tsarevich was healthy. The birth of any child is a time of celebration, but the Romanovs were particularly overjoyed when Alexei was born. Although he was Nicholas and Alexandra's fifth child, Alexei was their first boy. The parents adored their four daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, but a boy meant that the Romanov bloodline could continue. So when little Alexei came screaming into the world, the crowded room of doctors, attendants, and family members exploded with joy. If only they knew what fate had in store. Later that day, Tsar Nicholas retired to his office to write in his diary, as he often did. He wrote that the day was a great and unforgettable day for us. There are no words to thank God enough for sending us this comfort in a time of sore trials. Nicholas was right. Affairs in Russia were a complete disaster at the time of Alexei's birth. Russia and Japan were at war, and it was going badly, thanks in large part to the Tsar's incompetence. He saw Alexei as a good omen. Perhaps Russia's troubles were finally at an end. Sadly, he was mistaken. It only took mere moments for the celebration over Tsarevich Alexei's birth to be marred by worry. At first, he seemed like a perfectly healthy child. His aunt noted that he was an amazingly hefty baby with a chest like a barrel, and the air of a warrior knight. However, when the time came to cut the umbilical cord, they realized something was seriously wrong. The royal disease. That's what people called hemophilia in those days. Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom carried the gene for the disease, and that meant that any of her descendants, especially any males, had a very good chance of inheriting the condition. Nicholas and Alexandria had known that any son of theirs was at risk. Mere moments after Alexei's birth, they realized their fears had become reality. Alexei Romanov suffered from hemophilia, and it would come to define the poor child's all too brief life. Alexei's condition forced his parents to make an incredibly difficult decision. They kept it a secret. Only those who absolutely needed to know were privy to the information. That left many close family members and the Russian public at large completely in the dark. Nicholas made his son's illness a state secret to be kept at all costs. It took no time at all before the secret began taking its toll on the family. It wasn't long before people all over the world were making their guesses as to what ailed the young Russian prince. Some simply assumed it was tuberculosis. Others thought the outer layer of his skin was completely missing. After one particularly life-threatening hemorrhage, the press speculated that a crazed nihilist had attacked the Tsarevich with a knife. In most cases, the royal family would have immediately put such scandalous rumors to bed, but their secret tied their hands. As the incomprehensible silence from the Tsar continued, people couldn't help but assume the worst. However, behind closed doors, it was somehow even worse than any of the gossip hounds could ever have imagined. Cuts that won't stop bleeding aren't the only problems that come with hemophilia. There were countless other symptoms and concerns that became an everyday part of Alexei Romanov's life. But the worst by far was when internal lesions caused blood to seep into his joints. As his doctor put it, blood destroyed bones and tendons. He couldn't bend or unbend his arms or legs. In 1907, a 3-year-old Alexei Romanov stumbled and hurt his leg. Totally normal for a boy his age. But Alexei Romanov wasn't like other boys. The minor fall caused internal hemorrhaging. Within mere hours, the little Tsarevich appeared to be on death's door. He lay in bed, contorted in pain, with dark patches under his eyes and a frighteningly swollen leg. Doctors frantically did everything they could to save the boy, but nothing they did had any effect. The family grew desperate, and so they looked for help in a sinister place. The Romanovs were running out of options, but they would do anything to save Alexei. Alexandra called for a strange mystic from Siberia who claimed to be able to heal the boy. His name was Grigory Rasputin, and the Tsarina invited him straight into the royal palace. He prayed over Alexei's withering frame and said, "Your pain is going away. You will soon be well. You must thank God for healing you. And now go to sleep." Then Rasputin left, and the Romanovs prayed for a miracle. And they got one. By the next morning, Alexei Romanov was a whole new kid. While he lay in agony before, scarcely able to move, now he sat up in bed, his fever gone, eyes shining bright, and with the swelling in his leg completely gone. It truly did seem like a miracle. From that day, the Tsar and Tsarina trusted Rasputin above all else when it came to Alexei's health. He seemingly cured the boy when all hope was lost, but inviting this mystic into their lives came with terrible consequences. In hindsight, the Romanovs' decision to keep Alexei's illness a mystery was ruinous. The entire world could see that there was something wrong with the boy, but without knowing the truth, people's minds were free to assume the worst. Then, when a strange bearded shaman appeared, claiming to have mystical healing powers and gained incredible influence over the Tsar and Tsarina, people understandably had a few issues with that too. Perhaps those who didn't know the exact nature of Alexei Romanov's illness thought his family coddled him too much, but they didn't realize just how bad it was. When Alexei was 8, he took a carriage ride with his mother in the woods. Sounds pretty normal, right? Well, for Alexei, nothing was normal. Within minutes, he was barely conscious. He suffered many such attacks before, but this one was particularly horrifying. As a boy, Alexei's parents had to endure his screaming and crying when he suffered a hemorrhage. It was unbearable, but now that he was 8 and could talk, it was even more painful. The Tsarina remained at his side through all this. Tsar Nicholas sat with her as long as he could bear, but he would always eventually have to leave the room in tears, unable to watch his son suffer. Alexandra had only one option left. She sent a telegram to Rasputin. This time, Rasputin wasn't around to pray at Alexei's bedside, but his words still filled the Tsarina with hope. He simply wrote, "The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much." And that's just what she did. Despite their protests, Alexandra limited the doctor's contact with her son and prayed Rasputin's words would come true. The doctors simply could not believe it when Alexei made his sudden recovery within mere hours of Rasputin's telegram. They could find no medical explanation for the turnaround, but they couldn't deny that the boy was getting better. The days kept passing and Alexei's strength kept building. Unfortunately, this miracle sent the Romanovs down a dark path. At first, it was mostly the Tsarina who relied on Rasputin. The Tsar, meanwhile, viewed the mystic with a healthy amount of skepticism. But after this latest recovery, Nicholas was a believer. Rasputin was here to stay, although his insidious presence only increased the building mistrust that the people of Russia had for their rulers. For now, all they cared about was that Alexei Romanov was on the mend. He was free to grow up, although as he did, he became a little terror. Even at just 6 years old, Alexei Romanov had enough arrogance to last him a lifetime. He took to ordering his sisters about, and even worse, they listened, indulging in the boy's demands. Pretty soon, Golden Boy became spoiled brat. He was just a boy, but Alexei knew that he had power over the people in the palace. Unfortunately, Nicholas didn't do much to rein in his spoiled little heir. Nicholas believed that God himself had chosen him to be the Tsar, and thus he was utterly infallible and unquestionable. It also meant that he loved it when his son ordered people around. Nicholas taught Alexei that God had chosen him as well, and Alexei believed it. Unfortunately, it was that same belief in their own infallibility that led the Romanovs to the dank basement from which they would never leave. Since Alexei almost never heard the word no, it should come as no surprise that few people could control him. His sisters came to fear his wild temper, and there was little they could do to bring their younger brother to heel. The only person who could was their father, and the Tsar generally found Alexei's arrogance delightful, so he wasn't much help. Despite his frustrating tendencies, those who knew Alexei knew that there was an undeniable charm and charisma to him. Though disobedient, most in the palace put up with his antics happily. You might think they'd resent this little monster who ordered them around and broke their rules, but Alexei Romanov was more complicated than that. He could be bright and thoughtful and kind, and tragically, he possessed a knowledge of his own mortality that no child should. The boy had nearly died several times before he was 5, and he knew that our time on earth was not a given. He knew his sickness might claim him at any time, though he couldn't have known his end would be so much more tragic than that. For Alexei Romanov, the outbreak of World War I was great. Tired of being locked in the palace with little to do, the Tsarevich got the chance to join his father at the Russian army's headquarters. Though one might think the pampered prince would hate roughing it with the soldiers, Alexei was in heaven. He looked up to the men around him, and even started refusing his lavish meals, instead eating only the black bread of soldiers' rations. It was also his time of headquarters that Alexei showed the first signs that he might make a good leader after all. Though Alexei's station had given him an inflated ego, he did generally take his responsibilities quite seriously. When one officer learned that his son had perished at the front, Nicholas sent Alexei to sit with the grieving father. While still just a boy, Alexei showed maturity beyond his age when comforting the man. Nearing his teenage years, this little terror was finally coming into his own. Unfortunately for Alexei and the rest of the Imperial Romanovs, World War I was the beginning of the end. As Alexei had been growing up, his father had been making a bigger and bigger mess of things in Russia. Finally, his horrific decision-making during World War I pushed the people too far. During the February Revolution of 1917, revolutionaries apprehended the entire royal family, Alexei included, and forced Nicholas to abdicate his throne. Of course, a spoiled boy like Alexei didn't take well to captivity. While imprisoned in Tobolsk, he wrote of his unbearable boredom and begged for God to have mercy on him. Now, let's not get it twisted. The Soviets kept the royal family in an extravagant mansion, and they still had some of their servants with them. But as far as Alexei believed, It was torture. So he did what he always did. He acted out. The way Alexei saw it, life couldn't get any worse, so he started tempting fate. He played rambunctiously with a kitchen boy named Leonid Sidnev and took risks that he never would have before. At one point, he rode a sled down the stairs. Dangerous for any boy, but potentially fatal for Alexei. Alexei knew the risk, but he went down those stairs anyway. Still, I doubt he realized just how bad that trip would be. He injured his groin, causing an internal hemorrhage that quickly took a turn for the worse. Within hours, he could barely hold his head up, let alone walk under his own power. He needed a wheelchair just to get around. He couldn't have known, but he would never walk under his own power again. On July 16, 1918, one of their guards announced that Alexei's playmate, Leonid Sednev, was leaving the manor to visit his uncle. The family was furious. Sednev was Alexei's only friend. How could he leave so unceremoniously? Of course, none of them knew the dark truth. Sednev didn't leave to visit his uncle. He left because the guards didn't want him to witness what was about to happen. Later that night, guards hustled the Romanovs into a bare cellar. Nicholas demanded they at least bring in some chairs for his wife and ailing son. After bringing the chairs, a guard told the Romanovs to wait until a truck arrived to transport them to a secure location. However, just a few minutes later, the door reopened. This time, several guards filed inside, and one of them was holding a piece of paper. He faced the Romanovs and read it aloud. Nikolai Alexandrovich, in view of the fact that you and your relatives are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you. After that, there was no time to react. Within moments, smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the room. The guards, whether untrained, nervous, intoxicated, or a combination of all three, failed to give any of the Romanovs a swift end. Their arms finally fell silent, but as the smoke began to clear, they quickly realized that the execution had gone horribly wrong. The first thing that pierced the silence were the moans of Romanov children. The parents lay still, but Alexei and his sisters all still breathed. Each of them had jewelry sewed into their clothing, smuggled from the palace. The diamonds had managed to deflect the gunfire enough, so none of them had landed a fatal blow on any of the children. An officer ordered the guards to use their bayonets on the children instead. One by one, the remaining Romanov children stopped moving. It was a horrifying fate for children whose only crime was sharing their father's blood. But this was not yet the end of the story. With Alexei and his family out of the picture, the Bolsheviks now had to erase all trace of the messy execution. Guards stripped the Romanovs of all their clothes, drove them out to an abandoned mineshaft, doused them in sulfuric acid so no one could recognize them, then tossed them into the darkness below. That was the final resting place of the Romanov family, except for Alexei and one of his sisters. The guards had a plan for them that they hoped would throw anyone searching for the lost royals off their scent. Alexei Romanov didn't get to rest with his parents. Guards took his remains, along with the remains of one of his sisters, and tossed them into a smaller pit about 50 feet away from the mass grave. They figured anyone who found the remains at the bottom of the mine shaft wouldn't guess it was the royal family, as the Tsarevich and one of the girls wouldn't be there. In case you couldn't tell, the guards were mostly incompetent, but their plan actually worked, for a while. Amateur archaeologists discovered the site of the Romanovs' grave in 1979, but they soon realized something was wrong. 2 bodies were missing, one of the girls and Alexei. Rumors persisted for decades that perhaps the boy had somehow escaped, until 2007, nearly a century after his death, researchers found the remains of a preteen boy and a young woman in a fire pit nearby. DNA testing confirmed that the bones had belonged to Alexei and his sister Maria. Finally, after a century, the mystery of the Romanovs' end was settled once and for all. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see others like it, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button below and leave a like and comment on the video. Thanks for watching.